This is former heavyweight contender Baby Joe Macy. And he doesn't get it right often, but you're listening to Tim Graham and Friends.
CTBK gives executives and owners of mid-market businesses unparalleled confidence and clarity so you can focus on strategic objectives and organizational success. Their multidisciplinary advisors, accountants, and team members have a wealth of experience and are all available and responsive to each client to ensure the most effective advice, actions, and outcomes no matter the situation or complexity level. That experience base and one-team approach, combined with integrated and efficient way of operating, enable them to be truly proactive partners, doing the best thing for their client every time. Visit ctbk.com or call 716-630-2400 to learn how CTBK can work for you.
This is Charles Barkley, and you're listening to Tim Graham and Friends.
Welcome to another edition of Tim Graham and Friends. I'm Tim Graham of The Athletic here with Jonah Bronstein of Bronstein Sports Plus, joined also this week by Dave Naylor, football insider from TSN. And I've actually been trying to thank Dave. I can't say that we were partners on TSN Drive on TSN 1050 up in Toronto because I was your sidekick. So I was trying to think what that would make you. What is the obverse of a sidekick? My overlord?
I was
that's
say,
too much.
Captain, if you want to use sports.
Captain? My Toronto radio captain. Yeah.
Toronto radio captain. You were one of my assistants. I had a rotating cast of regular assistants, and you were in among them. And
okay.
Probably missed the drive to Toronto, I guess.
The drive home wasn't so bad. The drive up was a little hairy.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I don't miss that. I miss the scratch though.
Yeah. Even in Canadian dollars.
Yeah, it was even better. They paid me for the travel too.
That was awesome.
Well, we wanted to have Dave on because Chad Kelly is, and it's a complicated story, and I think that even Dave in his reporting at TSN, it's been a little confusing, and Dave has been on top of it. And it is an interesting story, whether Chad Kelly is from Western New York or not, whether he was Jim Kelly's nephew or not. It's still a fascinating story of he's 30 years old. I can't even call him a young man anymore, but somebody who just continually messes up and has gotten so many chances, and you think he's figured it out, but he never seems to figure it out. And maybe he's just star-crossed. Maybe he's just born under a bad sign. I don't know what it is. But Chad Kelly has run afoul of the authorities in the Canadian Football League and with the Toronto Argonauts. I don't know. Is he the face of the league? He's the
reigning most outstanding player. Led his team to 16-2 last season, playing in the biggest market. Second highest paid player in the league. That's a lot of boxes for any player in terms of prominence. Yeah.
Heroic all-time performance to help Toronto win the Grey Cup 2 years ago, coming off the sideline and and he didn't just manage that. I mean, they needed him to win that game. And it was a triumphant tale, especially for everybody who's familiar with him here in Western New York of, all right, well, it's the CFL. He didn't make it in the NFL, but this is pretty good, for a guy who's had to overcome a lot of his own self-inflicted wounds. Dave, we'll get into all the previous transgressions. But can you give just a quick overview? Then I'll give the transgressions because I think there's so many of them. I've written stories about Chad Kelly and I've forgotten some of these things because there's so many of them. But what is the story right now with him and the CFL and the Toronto Argonauts?
Well, right now, Chad Kelly is suspended by the Canadian Football League for a minimum of 9 games. And they have put on him conditions where he must attend counseling, go be assessed, be reassessed. And the league has reserved the right to review his discipline. And it was announced as a minimum 9-game suspension. There is also a legal process that is playing out between him and the assistant strength coach, former assistant strength coach. And that was what brought all this about. In January, or I guess it was February, the assistant strength coach, who was not being brought back at that point, I don't even know if that decision had been made, but she had been told that basically they were inviting her to reapply for a position, but were looking for some additional qualifications. And a lawsuit landed in February that said, that alleged that Chad Kelly had harassed her. And she alleged that the reason she was not being brought back by the Argonauts was the conflict and the tensions she'd had with Chad Kelly. So she sued him for harassment and sued the Argonauts for wrongful dismissal. And the league very quickly brought in a third party and said, we have asked for an investigation about what's gone on here. And I thought the league handled that very well. Rather than a rush to discipline, there were a lot of cries for different things from people. They said, no, we're standing back. We're not going to do this investigation. We are going to have people come in and get to the bottom of it for us. That produced an 87-page report, which was brought back about 3 weeks ago. Chad's representatives, the Argonauts, and the plaintiff's representatives received executive summaries of that report. A copy of that report was released to me, was leaked, I guess is the word, to me, or we obtained it. I guess I'd say TSN obtained it. And I wrote based on that report about the fact that the report corroborated 3 of 6 allegations that were in that suit against Chad Kelly. And, basically he was in the report that he says that he was trying to romantically get himself involved with the strength coach. There were, texts and other invitations that were made. And when he had conflict with her, at least one of which happened in front of other people, the other there is no witnesses for, that, he called her things that you don't call women and don't call coaches and don't call female coaches and don't call anybody in public in the workplace. And so, based on those 2 things, they said we can corroborate harassment based on the romantic advances and, the things that he said publicly to her, or at the Argonauts facility. The others were not corroborated. Those were, in fact, one of the ones that was not corroborated was that he had leaned on the Argos to make sure she wasn't getting her job back. They did not corroborate that. There was an allegation that he had said he'd hit her. That was not corroborated. And there was one more of the 6 I'm trying to think of that was, I know, it was that he was telling teammates that she was sleeping with another player on the team. And while it was corroborated that he was part of that conversation among other players, the report did not find evidence that he led it or brought it about. And so that one was not. So, look, I think there are some people who look at it and say, there's nothing physical here. He didn't show up at her condo at 3 a.m, intoxicated and banging on the door, things. But I mean, this is the expectations of a workplace, and this is the expectations for a prominent player. And this is, a woman who was made to feel in the workplace like she didn't feel like was acceptable, and she brought this forward. And the league, again, there's a civil case that I think is moving forward. And may or may not ever get to court, but in the league's eyes, they were willing to go off this report and hand him a very, very long suspension. He has not indicated about whether there will be an appeal. He was at Argonaut practice the same week that this came down. That was a public relations disaster. He has not been seen, to my knowledge, at or around the Argonauts training camp facility since that day that he appeared at practice. And I just to be very accurate, because, we're reporters here, he was not in a jersey throwing the football, running around the field. He was standing among the other quarterbacks, almost as if he was a coach. And it was a rookie camp, but they invite veteran quarterbacks to rookie camp. It's veteran quarterbacks, everybody else is a rookie. So normally Chad would have been there participating. On this day, he was not, but he was out on the field, and you would have just thought he was another coach or something. He had a baseball hat on, but just the the visualization and the description of him being on the field the same week this came down did not play very well in the market for the Argonauts.
Yeah, to make it seem that the Argonauts were okay with Chad Kelly, and maybe they even disagreed with the CFL.
That's what it appeared.
We want him around our team.
Yeah, and they said that day, like, oh, we're accepting the league's report. But then there was an explanation kind of like, well, if Chad's going to rejoin our team sometime, we want him around the team. Well, it was May the 8th, and he's got a 9-game suspension. That takes you to October, right? It's not a great rationalization. And look, and the league took a lot of criticism of this, but I got to try to take the league off the hook on this one. The rule says when you're suspended, you can't participate in games. There's nothing saying you can't be at practice. There's nothing saying you can't be in meetings. So that would have been left up to the Argonauts. There were a lot of people say, well, the commissioner should have said, well, you can't. There's a collective agreement like that the players and the league sign. And it says if guys are suspended, they can practice, they can attend meetings, they can do anything at the discretion of their team. And I would think that in delivering a 9-game suspension, Randy Ambrosie, the commissioner, was probably out on a pretty good limb there already. So does he really want to pick up the phone and tell the Toronto Argonauts, oh, by the way, I better not see him on the field? I mean, really, the CBA is very clear. That's a team decision. So I just there was a lot of blowback that went at the commissioner and went at the league on that one. And I just said, whoa. Like, there's a pretty, easy where to lay the responsibility for this one process here. It's very clear that was the team's decision, and obviously one that they regretted and reversed very quickly afterwards. And Chad did put out a statement. I would not describe it as an apology. It basically said, I've seen the report, and the way I am described in there is not the way I like to be thought of, and I'm going to lean into this counseling opportunity to try and grow. But there's not an apology. There's not a great act of contrition. And again, to be fair to him in that, that might be a heck of a thing for him to put out publicly as a civil case is still to come, right? Like, I think we understand the way that works. So
right.
He may have something different to say publicly if and when the civil case, gets settled. But at least at that time, I think he walked a very fine line in terms of the only public statement he has put out since this whole thing began.
Dave, how would you describe how big Chad Kelly is in Toronto? We talked about him being the most outstanding player, but in the hierarchy of sports in Toronto, therefore all of Canada in some respects, when the Maple Leafs are in the playoffs and the Raptors are still a big deal, the Argos and the fact that he is a Grey Cup champion quarterback, the whole thing. And of course it's baseball season. How big is this story in Toronto?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think it's a bigger story almost nationally than it is locally, which sounds crazy. But the Canadian Football League has a lot more gravitas in other parts of the country than Southern Ontario, which, the Argonauts have fallen way down the pecking order in this city compared to, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager. And Tim, as you know, I'm doing radio in Toronto. We didn't have a lot of, granular Argonaut conversations on the air.
That is true.
And that's,
we talk CFL a lot, but we didn't talk a lot of Argos. No. And
especially getting into, not the way, you and others and myself would cover the Buffalo Bills, where, a news event about a starter is the news of the day in May, where in Toronto, the team is covered more from sort of 5,000 foot view. But I think this is a bigger story across most within the Canadian football community across Canada. And look, make no mistake, Chad Kelly last year was his first year as a starting quarterback. By the end of the season, you could see Chad Kelly jerseys popping up all over the stadium. Their attendance, they had 27,000 at the last game, which was a playoff game that Chad Kelly started and, by the way, played horribly in. And coincidentally or not, some of the events that are cited in that lawsuit, the drama that was playing out took place 5 and 6 days before that game. I don't know if there's any correlation there or not, but the optics of it are like, you kind of wonder where his head was at for that game because it looked like it was somewhere else. But, Chad has, there's no question that his promise. Look, the Argonauts, had they made the Grey Cup, which they didn't because they lost in the Eastern Final, I can tell you as TSN, we would have had Chad Kelly prominent on SportsCenter 5 nights in a row. Guaranteed. Because it would have been part of our opportunity as the exclusive rights holder of the league to build his star a little bit for the Canadian Football League. That, as I often say, I play a journalistic role covering the CFL for TSN, but I also understand that TSN plays a promotional role for the league, and we would have pumped Chad Kelly up all Grey Cup week leading into that game. So, but hey, like I said, he was the most outstanding player in the league last year. The year before, as you mentioned, he came off the bench as a backup and rallied his team to a Grey Cup win. He was 16-2. They did not lose a game in the regular season last year that he started and finished. They lost a game where they benched him just on one of those end of season, we've clinched, you sit down, and they lost a game that he had to go out of at halftime with an injury. That's it. So in the other 16 games, for Chad, he was the guy. And there was even one game they pulled him out of just kind of for rest late in the game, and he came back in and they won it. So Chad Kelly was everything anybody could have hoped he would be as a football player. I believe he's the second highest paid player in the league. He has, promotional money in his contract to make appearances in and around Toronto, which would be very hard to fetch given, the kind of public image he has right now. But this guy, he was a bit of a gift for the CFL. I think everyone would understand there's all kinds of reasons why guys end up playing the CFL. Sometimes they're an inch too short. Sometimes their arms aren't long enough. Sometimes they got into a stacked depth chart somewhere and there was no opportunity. Sometimes they played to really small schools. And one of the neat things about covering this league is you do get to do a lot of stories about guys who've messed up elsewhere and come here, and sometimes they get an opportunity to go back to the NFL, and sometimes their life just blossoms here. And all of a sudden it's like, you know what? I'm not making millions. I'm making hundreds of thousands, but this ain't that bad. And they end up staying here. I can tell you the number of players I know who've spent their entire lives in Canada, raised their families here, become citizens, and thought they were coming here for 6 months before they come back to the NFL. But one of the kind of cool things as a journalist is you get to kind of tell those stories. And if you look at the day that Chad Kelly is drafted with the Mr. Irrelevant pick in 2017 by the Denver Broncos, I believe it's Mike Mayock, who's on the NFL Network broadcast. And the minute he's selected, Mike Mayock starts screaming about what a great pick this is. And here's what he says. He says, this is a first or second round talent who is going in the 7th round because of questions of character and injury, because he did have some injuries in college as well. So, I mean, that acknowledgement is made in the first 10 seconds that he's drafted. And, of course, he has the Von Miller incident, or the incident at Von Miller's home in Denver. There's
get it. Let me save that for me. I want to. I got the list here. I also want to make a quick point. You mentioned Mike Mayock, the other analyst at the time who was really pumping his tires was Bill Polian, and for obvious reasons.
Yeah,
and Bill Polian's analysis, especially later in his career, you roll your eyes about it. Lamar Jackson is a tight end.
Yeah.
His revisionist history about how they were going to draft Tom Brady, even though they already had Peyton Manning and whatever. But he said he called Chad Kelly the best quarterback in that draft class. And I'm going to read off some of the names in that draft class. So get ready to don't sprain your retinas. Mitchell Trubisky was the 2nd overall pick. Patrick Mahomes, Deshaun Watson, Deshaun Kaiser, Davis Webb, CJ Beathard, Joshua Dobbs, Nathan Peterman, Brad Kaya, Chad Kelly. So yeah, a few guys in there that, but anyway, Bill Polian said he was the best. Joan, I want to bring Joan in here, and Joan has been patient. You covered him from his high school days. When you think of his entire arc, Jonah, just what's your general thought on when you heard this news coming out of Toronto, the here we go again part with Chad Kelly? There have been so many points in his evolution where you thought, all right, maybe this is it. Too many of them. And again, I'll get into all of them, but Jonah, just what's your take on how
you want to read the rap sheet first? Because
you think I should?
Yeah, I think
okay, because maybe we need
into my analysis.
Okay,
the context is in the history is important.
Okay.
And by the way, Tim, before you read it, even though this is his first indiscretion in the Canadian Football League, I can guarantee you that list you're about to read played heavily in them going for 9 games. It wasn't like, well, he's never done anything. This is your first event. No, they treated this as if that was an add-on to the list that you're about to read.
And maybe they didn't go back this far, but as a freshman at Red Lion, Pennsylvania, it's a town on the eastern border of, I think, Maryland and Pennsylvania, or maybe Virginia. I don't know. My geography's, but anyway, it's in the eastern part of the state. Red Lion, Pennsylvania. He was suspended as a freshman, kicked off the team as a sophomore. So the family moves back to Western New York. He enrolls in St. Joe's and does very well. It's probably the only place where he didn't have a transgression that made it out into the public eye. In between St. Joe's and enrolling at Clemson, a rap song called Swag Kelly gets out, in which he has to live with that for the rest of his life. I don't know that it was supposed to see the light of day, but it's been a bit of an embarrassment, about a kid who hasn't really done anything yet, but he had a rap song about him. And before he gets to Clemson, he is taking shots on Twitter at Cole Stout, the Clemson quarterback, who's also the son of Cliff Stout, pretty much saying there's a reason you're on the bench. I'm coming for your job. Dabo Sweeney, not thrilled with Chad Kelly before he even steps foot on campus. 2014 spring scrimmage, there is a blow up as Chad Kelly gets upset that, and this is a scrimmage, that the team is going to punt on a 4th down play. He is kicked off the team after that. He goes to East Mississippi Community College and goes 12-0 at the place that is known because of the documentary as Last Chance U. Some irony there, but he goes to Last Chance U, does well, gets the job at Ole Miss. So a great turnaround for him. 3 days after signing at Ole Miss, he's arrested in Buffalo, the infamous Encore nightclub thing. He was underage, couldn't get in, or was trying to get a friend in at the door, says he's going to come back and spray the place with his AK-47, ends up getting charged with, let me clear my throat, 3rd-degree assault, 2nd-degree harassment, 2nd-degree menacing, resisting arrest, 4th-degree criminal mischief, 2nd-degree obstructing governmental administration. So Ole Miss keeps him. He does very well. He starts to become involved in Heisman talk, even, maybe not this year, but next year. And this guy's doing some amazing things in the SEC. While during a bye week with Ole Miss, he runs onto the field at a Timon St. Jude St. Joe's football game to get involved in a brawl. By all accounts, it doesn't seem like he threw a punch or really did anything, but it was stupid. Ole Miss is not happy with that. He does get drafted by the Denver Broncos. He makes the team on the injured list his first season, becomes the 2nd-string quarterback with the Denver Broncos with a depth chart that includes Paxton Lynch and Case Keenum. And if he keeps his nose clean, is probably the starting quarterback by the end of the year because he played well in practices. People are talking about how good he looked. He looked good in the preseason. And then at a Von Miller, I believe it was a Halloween party. Yeah, it was a Halloween party because I don't think he's dressed up as a cowboy just walking around, but wasn't he dressed up as a cowboy? Gets kicked out of the party, from what I remember correctly, because he's acting a fool, and he just starts walking the neighborhood, walks into somebody's house, plops down on the couch, and gets arrested for criminal trespass. The Broncos cut him. He signs with the Colts, but before he can play for the Colts, the NFL suspends him for 2 games because of that criminal trespass when he was with the Denver Broncos, and he pleaded guilty to that. The Colts eventually cut him, not on because he necessarily did anything wrong. They just didn't have him they just didn't keep him. And then takes a break from professional football for a little bit and then signs with the Toronto Argonauts. So, deep breath. I probably missed a couple of things, but that's a lot. Jonah?
Yeah.
All those points where you thought he'd figured it out.
Well, that was like kind of seeing my youth flash before my eyes because I covered Chad Kelly a little bit in high school, and I remember
I thought you were saying maybe you experienced some of those things.
Well, I was at Encore the night of that incident, although I wasn't there.
Oh, you were?
For the incident, but I was in that bar earlier in the night, probably when he showed up and tried to get in initially. I think I was inside. And I had gone home before.
I think he got in. He had a friend who couldn't get in, so he went to go say, hey, that's my buddy, probably like, hey, do you know who I am type thing. And maybe then they said, well, you can get the F out too. Anyways,
yeah, maybe,
I don't elaborate.
I've seen him. I saw him out at Western New York establishments around that time. when he may or may not have been 21 years old, but I was a bit older. But anyways, I think back to, I'm surprised you mentioned this because I didn't think this was on the official rap sheet, but the Swag Kelly rap song, because that seemed pretty scandalous at the time. Some of the things he said and maybe the image he was portraying, especially locally, and he had gotten a lot of positive coverage for his Connolly Cup season with St. Joe's and signing with Clemson. It was one of the biggest college signings for a local player in quite some time. And I don't know how many since then for football have really gone to a school like Clemson right out of a Western New York high school. And yeah, I don't remember the details, but him getting expelled from the school in Erie, Pennsylvania was always kind of told as a misunderstanding that he wasn't really at fault and that he came to St. Joe's.
Not Erie. It was on the east side of the state. It was
okay, all right.
Not Erie, but yeah.
My mistake. But that that he'd come to St. Joe's and he was a model citizen and a model teammate. And that was a raw deal he had gotten at the Pennsylvania school. And he was a good kid. And there was, not much to worry about him character-wise. That was, a lot of what was portrayed in the media. And if someone like myself would try to do some interviews, that was a lot of what we would hear on the record. On the time that Swag Kelly song came out, and so, might have been a little more to that. You mentioned the social media behavior and things like that, or could have just been things we were hearing through the grapevine, or even kind of noticing with our own eyes about the cocksure way he carried himself on and off the field. I had talked to somebody who was affiliated with St. Joe's football and very established in Western New York football, knows a lot of players and the coaches and the history and things like that. And I had mentioned something along the lines of, it seems like he's hanging around with the wrong crowd, and maybe there's some bad influences from people he's spending his time with. And that person told me, he said, no, he is the wrong crowd. He's a bad influence on these other football players that are hanging around him and kind of latching on to his celebrity in a way that he had locally and charisma, and that he was, a bad influence on the other students, and that St. Joe's and some people were eager for him to move on and not be, part of that program anymore at that point in time. A lot of his foibles early on in his career seemed to be youthful indiscretions and things that, could be chalked up to immaturity, and he would learn his lesson and not make those same mistakes again. And he would grow up, and maybe those mistakes that he had made would be learning experiences for him to be a better person and a better football player later on in life.
And I think being Jim Kelly's nephew, and there's a dichotomy there. Yes, he was, and when I did a feature story on him when he was at Ole Miss, I talked to Dennis Gilbert, who was the coach at St. Joe's at the time and longtime coach. And he said, he's kind of been cursed. He's not even Kevin Kelly's son. He's not Chad Kelly. He's always Jim Kelly's nephew. And so not only there's maybe a sense of entitlement that comes with that, my famous uncle, but by the same, I guess the second side of the same coin is I'm trying to be my own man. And when you're that young and maybe you're just trying to fight these things, and he obviously didn't know how to handle that, but he's trying to be himself, trying to plant his flag, while also having the entitlement of, do you know who I am?
Yeah, well, he definitely had a sense of entitlement, I think, coming up through high school and early on in college, being Jim Kelly's nephew, and also because there is no Jim Kelly Jr. So he wasn't the first nephew to come along, but he was the first great football player among Jim Kelly's nephew.
And that's another, and I'm interrupting. I'm apologize for interrupting, but I'm interrupting. That's another thing that came up in my story that I think is interesting dynamic. I've had Jim Kelly tell me a number of times over the years, I'm done with him. He's made one too many mistakes. But then you see who do they show on TSN sitting in the stands, right? It's always Jim Kelly sitting there proudly, he's never really done with Chad. But the thing that Jim told me for that story that I just referenced when Chad was at Ole Miss was, see if I can actually bring up the quote, because it's a pretty stern, and it has to do with the fact that there is no Jim Kelly Jr., that Jim Kelly's son had none of these opportunities, that Jim Kelly dreamed of playing catch with his son in the backyard and raising a Chad Kelly, probably like a kid that I could, watch his football career and see him go on to play at maybe Liberty, because that's where the Kelly kids all went. Maybe Jim Kelly Jr. goes to Liberty University and gets a look and ends up in the NFL. I don't know, just like Chad did. But Hunter obviously, and sadly, had Krabbe's disease and died at a young age and was unable to do any of these things. So I asked him, I asked Jim Kelly, about all the things that Chad Kelly has done to jeopardize this glorious future that Hunter was cheated out of. And he says, without a doubt, athletic ability, Chad has more than I had. Arm strength, close. I saw he had great potential, and I saw him pissing it away, not just once, not just twice, a few times. I thought, when is he ever going to get it? This was a story that was written in 2015. And so Jim Kelly was talking about, in light of what his son never had the chance to do, Chad Kelly just pissing it away.
Tim, just on the back of that, I had an opportunity first week of April to go to Jim Kelly's home in Orchard Park with Chad and interview the two of them together, like sitting on the same couch, which I was surprised, according to Chad. One, I was surprised Chad agreed to do it. And two, I was surprised when Chad said, no one has ever interviewed us together, ever. And another thing that surprised me that day was Jim Kelly looked into our cameras, and we aired this and said, if you had called me 2 years ago and asked me to do this, I wouldn't have done it. And he basically said, but I believe that Chad has learned his lessons. I believe he understands the opportunity that is before him to be the starting quarterback of the Toronto Argonauts. And I believe he's ready for this. That is on that. We aired that not even 12 months ago. So, to your point about
it's the roundabout that Jim Kelly has always gone through with Chad.
Absolutely.
He's been in that position. He's probably has said that quote 10 times over the last 9 years, right? He's like, I'm done. But he's told me to my face, I'm done with him. And of course but again, it's family. And he does have some salvation. He does, so I guess you keep trying. At 30 years old, you're eventually will run out of these opportunities. And maybe he's had his last.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, early on in his career, a lot of people believed that he was a future NFL player, if not an NFL star, and that he would be coming in and being the next generation Kelly quarterback. And I think Chad Kelly certainly believed that himself. So some of the things he got in trouble with in high school and college, there was this belief, I think, that he was a rising star that didn't need to keep his nose clean because his talent was going to take him to the NFL anyways. That wore away with the more and more he got in trouble and the injuries, and only getting drafted with that last pick in the 7th round, we believe, because Jim Kelly, called in a favor to John Elway, and not making it in the NFL and getting in trouble kind of again and again. So where by the time he surfaces in the Canadian Football League, that's all off the table. He's sort of, we believe, humbled and has learned his lesson. And there's a good story in The Athletic from 2 years ago where he talks about all the self-sabotage, that was his words, from earlier in his career. And now that he's playing in the CFL and has gone through that and washed out of the NFL, he sort of understood, how to be a better person and a better teammate and a better human being. And it's disappointing to see now that he's 30 years old and continuing to make mistakes and not learn from the mistakes. And for every legal issue or off the field issue he's had, there's been sort of a redemptive arc to his story where he's come back, usually based on his football ability. And so you wonder, is this going to happen again? But I think there's also an appetite to stop seeing that happen, because I don't want to read another story in 2 years about how much he learned his lesson from this incident, or what he's saying, the counseling. He should be past that, long past that, a long time ago, and out of second chances and excuses and beliefs that he just needs to grow up and learn how to be better.
Well, I think that's why the CFL dropped the discipline on him that they did. There's been some saying that does that suspension fit what he did? And there's been some arguing and back and forth about that. But I think there's a sense that the league thought if they suspended him for 3 games with no other requirements, that they were going to be back in this situation, that it was going to take something more substantial to give him an opportunity to kind of redeem himself. And that's why they gave him the 9 games. It's funny. One of the things Chad Kelly told me, and I don't want to quote him incorrectly, but when we were doing research for that feature last year, he said something kind of to the effect of, I grew up believing that if I was good at football, nothing else would matter. That's kind of the way he described the way he saw the world, as a kid. And that sort of, plays out. And I'm going to go back to a day in September. And like I said, I don't care who wins anything in sports anymore, but I'm a human being, and I do like redemptive stories. And I feel good for people when I see things kind of go positive in their lives. And the day that the Argos announced Chad Kelly's new contract last year, like the one that made him the CFL franchise quarterback money, you're the guy, blah, blah, blah. I went out to the practice that day because they were announcing it. The sky was blue. The grass was green. Chad Kelly looked like $1 million in his Argonaut uniform. There were all these suits from Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment that don't normally go to Argo practices. He was getting congratulations and handshakes and taking pictures. And I stood back that day and I just thought, man, this guy is now like the highest paid player in the CFL. He's the football son of Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, a big, rich, powerful company in Toronto. Nobody really remembers what he did in the States. He's 2 hours from where he grew up. Like I sat there and thought, man, what a great thing this has been. And there was, my producer had written a line in the feature we did. He said, in Canada, there is no history, only a future. That was kind of what Chad found when he crossed the border. And of course, since all that, all this stuff has come up. And the flaw in so many of the stories that you tell, Jonah, or that rap sheet that you read there, Tim, so much of it is just bad risk reward decision making. What do you have? What's at stake? What do you have to gain? What do you have to lose? And I think that's the flaw in his decision making pretty much every step along the way. And I say it was the weird thing about his story was, for the first 2 years he was in the league, you didn't hear anything. I'm pretty tapped in this league, talked to a lot of people, have a lot of conversations. I think everybody knew he had maybe a bit of a sharp personality at certain times and places, but there was no sense. And I know people who worked in that organization, who have worked in that organization that I trust, who would tell me, no, 2022, when he was the backup, nothing, he was good. Then, he became the starter in 2021. And it was the only conversation was just about, how good he was. But here's something else that's telling about the reputation he left behind in the U.S. Chad Kelly had an outstanding season last year at age 29. Now, 29 for a defensive back is old, but 29 for a quarterback is not. You know how many NFL workouts Chad Kelly had last offseason?
None.
I believe it's 0. And I'm telling you, there's some really marginal players who have some really marginal levels of success in the CFL, and they still get workouts. Some get signed. Some are there for, just a cup of coffee. And as we know, there are guys that make careers out of the CFL. And I had a former NFL coach I had a chance to talk to at one point in the midst of his success last year. And I said, would you bring him in based on what you've seen? And he said, not a chance. And he wasn't talking about his football ability.
Yeah. How much we've mentioned his salary being big. What's he making? What is it?
I believe last year his number when they signed the deal was about $700,000 a season. He restructured some of that because there's some things you can do, similar to the NFL, where they bring your number down. There's a tax advantage for taking, especially as an American, taking a large part of your salary in signing bonus. You're taxed at a lower rate. So the number is, I think, now around $600,000 after they did some restructuring. But I mean, yeah, that's pretty good money when you're not comparing it to NFL quarterback salary for. Again, right. Just so people understand CFL, economics and schedules, they basically have you from the first week of May till the third week of November. And other than that, there's no OTAs. Like you are, that's $700,000 for 5 months commitment, playing 2 hours from your home.
Right. Dave, maybe this is dangerous territory because then we're getting into believability or credibility. And maybe right. I don't want to put any aspersions on anything that was accused or the accuser. We talked about the bad risk reward decision-making. How much of this in your mind could it just be bad luck or damn it, this isn't my fault? it is possible. Things happen sometimes where, and I'm not saying that there's any lies being told, but it's just like, hey, whatever happened in this world to being able to make a pass at a coworker without it being an HR problem. Whatever, people meet at work and fall in love all the time. Mm-hmm. What's just your general take on this whole thing in terms of again, you say it's outsized suspension because it's based on past, and I agree. It does seems like a little much, but I don't know. There's not a question I'm asking there, but I think you get the spirit of what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. I know where you're going with this one. And I think that's again where Chad probably has to be aware of his own history, and understand that if he does cross a line, it might be viewed more differently than if the players would. And I'm not advocating or endorsing players doing things in the workplace that they shouldn't do. But Chad just had, a lot more to lose. And he had a history that was going to make his defense more difficult. Those are just, I think, pure realities of it. Now, to your point, a little bit, there is an 87-page report on Chad Kelly and this incident. The executive summary only includes kind of things about the allegations against him that were contained in the civil suit. The Players Association has filed a grievance asking for the full 87-page report. And I think, the reason they've done that is that if they have to defend Chad Kelly in an appeal, they will probably look for things in that report that maybe the club should have done, or could have done to not make this all, to have it all hung on Chad Kelly, that maybe, hey, they should have known this was going on, or why was this not reported, or this was reported and it didn't go, those kinds of things.
Yeah, the team should be fined for bad diligence or
to share some of the responsibility. I think that's why the Players Association has filed that grievance, because obviously when you do an executive summary to a report that you paid to have commissioned, you can cherry pick what you share with the parties involved here, as opposed to seeing the whole thing. So that's part of it. But I think in today's, I think this is another part of this for the Canadian Football League. This is my speculation. I just saw a graphic the other day about all the female coaches in the National Football League. There are female officials, there are female coaches, women are being encouraged to take up careers in the sport. And I think part of the league's thought on this one is, a shot across the bow, not just at Chad Kelly, but across all 9 CFL teams across this league, and saying, hey, this is 2024. This is the work environment. This is not an old boys club. And you cannot treat women in the workplace the way you might approach a woman in a bar at a nightclub. Like that's not what we are about here. And that is essentially, I think, part of what the league kind of wanted to, and not to say they want to use Chad as an example, but in a way it was like, if we send a really strong message over this, we can send a message to any other players who, thinks that there's a woman in the work environment that they'd like to have a romantic, experience with. And I think the point is, it's like once she says no, and you start returning and going back and making other gestures, that's where it turns into, an innocent romantic gesture, if you might, into what can be harassment. And, so that's where I think that lives.
Dave, how much do you think, and this is just popping in my head, I don't know, how much do you think that the NHL's for the past few years, talking about, the Blackhawks in particular, but the NHL and also the youth hockey in Canada, we're talking about Team Canada and the World Juniors from a few years ago, and this toxic masculinity, boys will be boys. How much do you think that would maybe make the CFL a little more sensitive to workplace types, that we've got to make sure that this doesn't happen in our offices?
I think that's a fair speculation. I wouldn't be surprised, because those are particularly the ones involving the junior hockey players. That is a prominent story in this country that is regularly in the headlines. And I think you understand the public relations horror of being associated with something like that. And the CFL as a league where, its fan base is a little thinner and maybe, more vulnerable. The league is more vulnerable to like losing fans and having them walk away. So there's probably, self-interested part of that as well. Although I will say this about the CFL, in the time that I've covered this league, there is a time where they, if you had talent and you could get attention and you could get cameras to the field, my goodness, it almost didn't matter what you did. They would find a way to get you in this league and kind of stand back.
It was the place where NFL players came to clean up. It was almost like detox.
It was, yeah. Whereas, and now I'll just speak for this commissioner. When Johnny Manziel came here, I mean, he was still a pretty big deal. This is 2018. So he's not that far removed from the Heisman Trophy and being a first round pick. And they put him through basically a behavioral contract that he had to sign to play in the league. No player in the history of the Canadian Football League has had to clear greater hurdles just to sign a contract than Johnny Manziel. In fact, I believe the commissioner put a pause on his negotiations with the Ticats in the fall of 2017 and said, I'm intervening. If Johnny Manziel wants to sign a CFL contract, he's got to meet with me and we got to have a talk about some conditions he's going to answer. And we're going to put some stuff down legally so that we don't have to deal with this if he goes off the rails. Now, I'd never seen that before. And there were people, I'd take issue with people who said, wow, the CFL just turned a blind eye to whatever Johnny Manziel. Absolutely not. No player in the history of the CFL has ever faced the scrutiny before signing a contract that Johnny Manziel did and played under the conditions that he did. And when Johnny Manziel violated those after his first offseason, gone. I mean, like a one-line press release. I remember because I was in Mexico and I remember saying to my producer, you're in luck. I haven't had any, tequilas today. I can do a hit on this one from a all-inclusive resort in Mexico, but it was still early in the day. But it was a one-line press release. And I think what this commissioner, at least, and this league administration understands is that you have to put guys like Johnny Manziel and Chad Kelly on a short leash, because if you give them a long one, they will hang themselves and they'll drag your league down with it. And that's the way they handled Johnny Manziel. And that is absolutely how they handled Chad Kelly. Because the point I should make is his CFL resume, again, to my knowledge, clean for 2 seasons. So it's not like the commissioner got fed up and said, my God, I can't believe I'm dealing with another Chad Kelly matter. No, this is the first one we know of. There's another weird one at the end of the playoff game last year where he told people he had a concussion, which in today's day and age, when you come off the field and say, my issue was that a concussion, obviously there's spotters, there's trainers, there's coaches. I know the league's lawyers went through every play of the East Division final last year between the Montreal Alouettes and the Toronto Argonauts and could not find a shred of evidence that suggested Chad Kelly had suffered a concussion in that game. I mean, there's just nothing that anybody would even pick up if you're looking for it every single play. So that was probably his first red flag and the first time he became a headache for the league, because of course they drew all kinds of, criticism and how could this happen? And meanwhile, it doesn't look like it did happen. But I think that's kind of part of how this got to where it is certainly, the commissioner just understanding that guys like this, lots of upside for what they do on the field, but they can take your league down a few notches with what they can do off it.
What does this do for the Argos title hopes?
I mean, you pull a starting quarterback off any team 2 days before the start of training camp, any professional team, what does that do to them? Okay, the guy happens to be the MOP of the league, the best player in the league. I mean, yeah, you show me a professional football league who takes the outstanding player at quarterback off the team. Yeah, and this is a team that, and this is similar to happens in the NFL.
What's the alternative? What's the depth chart look like?
Cameron Dukes, who played at a small school, Lindsay. Honest, I'll just say this. It's a school I've never heard of. And like you, Tim, I'm around football all the time. You feel like every school you've heard of somewhere. It's I believe a D2 school in Kentucky somewhere, not one I'm familiar with. The third stringer is Brian Scott, who played at Occidental. Is a D3 guy. Like the Argonauts had the most inexperienced quarterback room in the league last year. Chad Kelly was the most, and actually to that point, I had an Argonaut player that I was talking to about this about 2 weeks ago. And he said to me, big mistake we made. we put Chad Kelly in a quarterback room where he was the most experienced guy. We needed a veteran guy there. We needed somebody who could call him out, somebody who could, show him the way, somebody who wasn't afraid of him. And the year before, they did have that. They had McLeod Bethel-Thompson, who, NFL fans would remember his name because he's played on 11 teams, or never played, but he's been part of about 11 different roster maneuvers.
Probably played on your team.
Probably
he was with your team at some point.
And if you're a 49ers fan, he might have been with your team about 4 times. So but he was, and so when they brought him back in 2023, there was no veteran in that room, no veteran in the meeting, no veteran to practice at his position. That's something that somebody highlighted to me. So yeah, they are screwed, not just because they didn't have a veteran there to help keep Chad in kind of on the rails. They're also a bit screwed because now that he's going to be gone, I mean, Cameron Duke's only playing time was in games that didn't matter to the Toronto Argonauts, and the one game where Chad got hurt. That's it. So yeah, it's a very, very, open-ended part of this.
Well, all three of us were at the Bills Media Day on Tuesday for voluntary workouts. Dave came down across the border to cover for TSN. Jonah there for Channel 4. What did we learn? Did we learn anything? I mean, so many news conferences. It's tough to learn.
I'll say this.
We're not necessarily allowed to report on what we see, out on the field type stuff.
I learned more about Dave's background as a box lacrosse player than I did anything about football or the Bills that day.
We talked lacrosse. We were talking lacrosse. Absolutely.
You were a box lacrosse player?
I was a third liner on one of the worst box lacrosse junior teams in the history of junior lacrosse in Ontario. My dad was a 3-time national champion. So, the apple fell a long way from the tree. And
somebody kicked it.
Somebody kicked it down the orchard. But yeah, I did play the game. I was a good minor player, but when I moved into the area where everybody, could catch and throw, like that was not a question. Athleticism and heart and skill and all those things took over, and I moved down the depth chart.
And you got into journalism.
And I got into journalism, yeah, writing about athletics and instead of trying to be one.
What everybody hears our thoughts all the time, Dave. So what do you think about the Bills and the offseason moves that they've made and their outlook for 2024?
I feel positive about it because Josh Allen is still healthy and he's 28. The offensive line is coming off of a very, very strong year. So the changes that they've made to the offensive line are not forced upon them. These are not fixed changes. These are changes that they're making from a position of strength, sort of for now and for the future. And I mean, when you look at the receiving unit and you look at the variety of skills and experience and some youth there, and then throw Dalton Kincaid into it. I mean, I think we all have watched the Buffalo Bills at times and seen the ball forced to Steph Diggs and seen, like, is that really the best option over and over and over again? And I know that didn't happen the second half of last season, but there was always that. Steph was almost, it's like when you get one of these alpha receivers, it's the elephant in the room. Got to keep them happy. And
I don't think it's a coincidence, Dave, that Josh Allen looked like a zombie for the first half of the season, and he turned into his old self second half of the season while Steph Diggs was running routes without the ball coming to him too up, or running 2-yard routes, catching the ball at the line of scrimmage. It just seemed like Josh Allen seemed liberated in some way.
Well, and I always go back to the stats on Steph Diggs, right? 2 games last year against the Kansas City Chiefs, one a virtual must win on the road, and won the playoff game that they lost. He did not have 25 yards receiving in either of those games. That is astounding to me. And I don't know how, people can be worried about parting with Steph Diggs when basically the 2 biggest games of the year, he vanished. So I'm curious of what, a larger target share for Khalil Shakir will be. Like, what's his upside if he takes a more prominent role? And I even find Chase Claypool kind of fascinating. I mean, I was funny.
Your fellow Canadian.
Well, and like I hope Chase has learned something in this regard, but there's an article.
How about some Chad Kelly metaphors here?
I mean, this is just about attitude, right? I think is that there's an article you can find less than 24 months ago where Chase Claypool says, I'm not a top 5 receiver in the NFL. I'm a top 3. Less than 20. It's June of 2022. Okay. He's number 6 on the Bills depth chart right now. I'd be hard pressed to find a guy who's fallen that far, who didn't have a major injury and didn't end up in jail. It's just team stuff. Right.
And he's a smart guy, Notre Dame, the whole thing. I mean,
the whole thing.
I mean, sounds great talking to him on Tuesday. I mean, it's like, wow, people are, oh, geez, Sean McDermott is charmed by this guy so far. But he signs a 1-year, $1.1 million contract with a $25,000 signing bonus. The only commitment. Ooh, sorry if you're listening there. I just hit the mic. If that came through, I'm sorry. But he's guaranteed $25,000. Meanwhile, people out of his draft class, let's just say, obviously Justin Jefferson was he's going to break the bank. Yeah, he was a first round pick. Chase Claypool was a second round pick. But those guys were the all rookie receivers for that year. Chase Claypool had that good of a rookie season, and now he's on a throwaway contract by NFL standards anyway. And Gabe Davis was a 4th round pick that same year. Chase Claypool would, probably do bad things for a Gabriel Davis contract right about now.
It's interesting, Tim. Chase Claypool, one of the things that just struck me is he's 25. I know he turns 26 in about 7 weeks, but there are guys coming out of college now at 24, for God's sakes, right? With all the transfers and things. So, look, the fascinating thing to me about Chase Claypool is I can see him getting cut or being on the practice roster. I can also see them having a couple of injuries, him having an outstanding camp, and by October the 15th, he's a 7 target a game guy, and winds up with a stat line at the end of the year, playing regularly with Josh Allen that doesn't look that different than the ones he had his first 2 seasons. I don't think that's crazy. Like, would I bet on that happening? No. Would I say I think he's going to have 900 yards and 12 touchdowns? No. But if I went to sleep and woke up in January and found out that happened, I wouldn't say I would have discounted that as any possibility that could happen.
Right.
And that's where the win is for the Bills.
He also could be playing for the BC Lions this season.
I believe Saskatchewan has his rights, but I could be wrong.
All right. Touche.
Not sure about that one. Because he was drafted. Like, teams will always take a flyer on a guy like that, right? Because who knows,
Right.
And so, like, Christian Covington just signed with the BC Lions after 8 NFL seasons. The draft pick wasn't wasted. They just had to wait 9 years. But it's no, I think that one's for the Bills. It's like, boy, you talk about, just in life, all upside, no down. If he's a problem, goodbye. If he's not in shape, goodbye. If you don't need him, goodbye. But the potential upside of that one, I like it. And I just like the variety of skill sets that they have at receiver. I think I probably would be somebody who would say you're better to have a bunch of different guys who can do a bunch of different things at various levels of experience in the league than you are to have, $31 million fed into one guy like Steph Diggs, who, like, make no mistake, he was outstanding for so much of his time there, and he took the Bills to a different place, but they never won with him. And as you guys, I'm sure, have discussed ad nauseum, the trend was not in the right direction. And then you factor in, his age with that trend. And I certainly understand, although on the surface, I didn't understand what the heck the Bills were doing the moment it happened. And like most big news that on beats that I cover, it happened the day I was on vacation on a plane to Belize, but always seems to happen that way. Land in Belize. What?
Did you drink on the plane? Were you able to do a hit?
No, actually, I did the next day. I got a call from a radio interview in Edmonton. They wanted me to do it. And I said, the only reason I'm saying yes is I got a lot to say about this, and I haven't been able to say it to anyone. So
the TSN station in Edmonton is pretty aggressive.
Absolutely.
I get calls from them all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Anything else we want to talk about here, boys, before we wrap up? Anything else with the Bills? Observations from Tuesday? You going to be back down next Tuesday for the next practice, Dave?
I don't believe I'll probably won't be back to training camp till training camp at this point. I'm just curious about whether they can. And we didn't talk about the defensive side of the ball, and I'm probably guilty and maybe this is appropriate, of falling into that kind of trap of like McDermott will figure it out. You know what I mean? Like when you look at what he did on the fly with that defense last year, with all the pieces they were missing, and the safety position in particular, we kind of have this deferential attitude that, well, of course you'll figure that out. That's all he's ever done. He turned two guys that, were basically street free agents into, all-time Bills at that position. So, but I'm maybe just being deferential to Sean McDermott on the defensive side of the ball, and I'm curious, like you are, about what Josh Allen will be like when he doesn't have to keep track of how many targets his number one guy has got.
Yeah, well, I think you notice one definite difference in Josh Allen from a year ago is his demeanor at this press conference on the first OTA, where last year he had to answer questions about Stephon Diggs and put on a front as if there was really nothing going on, when, as we learned behind the scenes, there was at least something. And there was a lot of, I think it was a bigger distraction at that point in the season than it ever got to be during the season, or at least from what we saw. And now, it was Josh Allen's birthday, but he has a new handshake with all of the different receivers that are on the team already. And he's throwing passes to the rookie, and MVS is, wishing him a happy birthday and saying they're going to get him an MVP this year. It was a much different emotional tenor for the Josh Allen press conference after the first OTA. And maybe you don't learn a lot about the X's and O's and the footballs watching these practices, I don't think, but maybe something more about, kind of what's going on with the locker room and the team.
The vibe. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they were pretty loose, although, you'd expect that. They're still a long way away from training camp. A lot of these guys seeing each other for the first time in a while. But yeah, it was, and there's no Lombardi Trophy banner hanging inside the field house anymore. Although it was pointed out to me that I guess there's like a faded in the background. You can kind of see something. It could just be a football, though. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Lombardi Trophy, but it's clearly it's not reflected in the visor of the banner caddy corner away, which always bothered me, because if it's reflected in the visor, it should be facing the other direction because it's a mirror, and it wasn't. That always bothered me. So I'm glad to see that one down, especially. Dave, thanks for doing this. Saw you on Tuesday, and I thought it was such a natural to have you on to talk about Chad Kelly, because there's so much, and it's confusing because of the way it's rolled out. The CFL and the Argonauts didn't seem to quite be on the same page, and maybe still aren't. I don't know, but it's a head shaker of a story. But here we are.
Yeah, and you know what? And I'm sure everybody has said this so many times. I really hope that this is it for Chad. That this is the one that's like, shows him what he has to lose. And no one's asking him to be perfect. No one's asking him to be all those things. They're just asking him not to be things that cause a distraction and that are not fair to people that he works with. That's right. Basically, yeah.
Doesn't seem too tough.
I think it's a pretty modest bar. Yeah.
Dave Naylor of TSN, thanks for doing this. Thanks to everybody out there for watching and for listening to Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants. Please subscribe, follow, like, comment, do all the things. Grateful for your patronage.
CTBK gives executives and owners of mid-market businesses unparalleled confidence and clarity so you can focus on strategic objectives and organizational success. Their multidisciplinary advisors, accountants, and team members have a wealth of experience and are all available and responsive to each client to ensure the most effective advice, actions, and outcomes, no matter the situation or complexity level. That experience base and one-team approach, combined with integrated and efficient way of operating, enable them to be truly proactive partners, doing the best thing for their client every time. Visit ctbk.com or call 716-630-2400 to learn how CTBK can work for you.